Hello and welcome. First off, I'm going to apologize for the very unprofessional setup. I have my cell phone kind of wedged in place here. It's what I've got for the moment. There was an idea that I had to do some basic hand stitching tutorials, and I posted it up, threw it up on my Tumblr, and there were a few people that were actually interested. So we're going to go with that. A couple of things. First, most of what is made can be done using 3 basic stitches, and it can all be done by hand. You see a lot of the Renaissance and Victorian clothing, and they're really well put together. They're very intricate, but it was all done by hand. The first sewing machines did not come out until the middle part of the Victorian era. Everything before that literally was done by hand. It took a lot of time and a lot of effort, but it was well worth it. A couple of things that really help. First thing is a thimble. This is just a quilter's thimble. You can get them just about anywhere for a couple of bucks. Normally, if you hit up garage sales and stuff, you might be able to find one for next to nothing. Or if you go to like the Goodwill website or something along that line, you can sometimes find entire sewing kits, and they'll normally have some sort of a thimble. The most important thing for a thimble is that it fits snugly on your finger. I mean, I'm pushing on the back side, and you can see it's not really moving around a lot. Okay. Second thing is to know that there are multiple types of needles. I tend to use what's called sharps. And they're called sharps because the tip is very sharp. They also have rounded tips and in-betweens. But I do tend to use sharps. One of the tips and tricks that I've learned over the years, because I have been sewing by hand for mumble. I started sewing dolls' clothes for my Barbies, I think it was, when I was 6 or 7 years old with my grandmother's assistance. And it's been almost 40 years since then. I am in my mid-40s, and I really haven't stopped. But one of the things that I learned is a trick on how to not ever have to put a knot, or very rarely have to put a knot in your thread. So that's something I'm going to show you. It's actually pretty simple. Normally when people tell you to thread your needle, they tell you to take one end of the thread and put it through the hole. And then you tie the knot in the 2 pieces of thread together. To avoid having the knot in your thread, you or I lick the thread so that the 2 ends kind of stick together. Put both ends through the eye of the needle, and then pull it so that the end comes down, and then the opposite end of the thread becomes this loop. Now I'll show you what to do with that here in a moment. Okay, the first stitch that I'm going to show you is just a straight or running stitch. And I'm using for this just a scrap of cotton. I've been putting together some Victorian undergarments. If you'd like, I will show you my Victorian underwear at some point when it's done. It's not done yet. But this is just some scrap cotton that was left over. It will eventually be cut up into teeny tiny pieces that we call slaw. The leftover is cabbage. When it's cut into teeny tiny pieces, it's called slaw, and that's actually used for stuffing for things like bum rolls or a padding for other things. Or if you create what's called a tailor's ham, you can make your own. And that's all stuffed with cut up pieces of spare fabric. Now the straight stitch is one of the first things that anybody ever learns. If you put a knot in the end of your thread, you will come up from behind and put your needle through. But since we're not doing that, I'm actually going to go down from the top, just put the needle through and pull until that loop comes almost all the way up. You can see it kind of laying there. And then you move the needle over slightly, whatever length of the stitch you want it to be, and poke it back up. And then you put the needle through that loop so that it catches it. So the loop, you can see, is on either side of the needle there. And pull the needle up and pull it tight. That locks your thread into place and creates your first stitch. When you're first learning a straight stitch, the first thing that people are taught, the first thing I was taught when I was a small child, is you go down and pull it tight, and then up and pull it tight, and down and pull it tight, and you continue on. However, as you get better and you learn a little more, it takes some practice. Everything takes practice, but instead of going down in one motion, up in the next motion, this is where the thimble comes in handy. You place the needle, whatever your stitch length is, you push it down and then up again at approximately the same length. Now I say this is where the thimble comes in handy because it's actually harder to push it through. I'm just going to use my thumb to pin that in place very carefully, and I'll show you that the needle itself, you can kind of see, is stuck into one of the ridges of the thimble. So the butt end of the needle is not pushing against your finger because that would be right about there on the edge of the fingernail, which is really painful. Please don't do that if you can avoid it. But then you can use that and just push using that thimble and push it through and pull it taut. And you get to the point where you just kind of know, it's muscle memory. Your hands figure out where you need to be, or where your hands need to be, where your fingers need to be to get the needle up against that thimble correctly. You push it through. And because this is just a small piece of fabric, the loop is grabbing the edge of the fabric. All I'm doing is pulling it off and pulling it to taut. It's also called a running stitch. We'll behave. It's also called a running stitch because once you get used to your stitch length, you can do several stitches at a time. So instead of doing down and up and then pull taut, as you can see also this is used for gathers. You get enough stitches in and then just pull the thread and your fabric will gather. And then you tie a knot at the end of the thread and stitch the gathers onto whatever foundation piece that you have, and they'll stay in place. But it's also called a running stitch because instead of doing a single stitch, you can also, again, put that against your thimble, do multiple stitches at one time. Well, if my hands will cooperate. It's down and up. There's 2. There's 3. Push it through using that thimble. And there's 3 stitches created. This is the first. This is what's generally used for what's called basting, which is just holding fabric in place. It's used on some of the inside seams that are going to be gone over again. It's used for gathers. This is one of the least secure stitches, but it's also one of the first you learn. The second stitch is what's called the backstitch, and it's just working off of the straight stitch, and instead of going forward and doing a single stitch that direction, which just does another running stitch, instead you put your needle at the end of the running stitch, push it down, go past where the thread comes up and out again at approximately the same length, so that you get a nice stitch. Push it through, pull it taut, and then again it's down at the end and then up past where the thread comes through. This is one of the more secure stitches. This is actually what was generally used in all of the seams that would bear pressure. This is what was used, well, corsets are a good example. Corsets had a lot of pressure put against them because they were bound tight to the body. And whether it's a man's corset or a woman's corset, a lot of pressure is put on the seams. And this creates a nice secure seam that can handle the amount of pressure being put on it fairly easily. I'm going to go ahead and flip it over so you can take a look at the back side and you can see the difference. You can see where I moved to the back stitch. This again is that straight stitch or running stitch, and this is the back stitch. And you can see how it just holds it a little bit better. It's a little bit more secure. There's less puckering. If you look at the shadows here, there's less puckering in the back stitch than there is in the straight stitch. The third thing is what's called a running back stitch, and it's kind of a combination of the two. So you start out by tacking your thread down or by doing a simple back stitch, and then instead of doing another back stitch, you do a series of running stitches. So you do 3 or 4 or 5 stitches and pull it up, and then this is what's used in case you want to make sure that accidental gathering does not happen, or if you want to baste something in place a little bit more permanently, it just needs a little bit more security. But you do the running stitches, and you do a back stitch, come up, do another series of running stitches. So you've got the back stitch here, and you've got the series of running stitches, which as it pulls taut you will be able to see. These are the 3 basic types of stitches that have been used to create clothing since clothing has been stitched together. So for hundreds of years, I guess thousands of years probably at this point. But they are fairly simple. It will take quite a bit of practice. As I said, I've been sewing for almost 40 years. And it took a lot of practice to be able to do this. But I don't want you to get discouraged. I want you to try. And if you can, drop me a line. I am going to leave some contact information. Try a couple of stitches. See what you can do. and I'd like to see what you're doing with them. I'd like to see where you're at. And if you'd like, I can save the images for you, or at least for some of you, if you request. Or I would encourage you to save it yourself and then keep trying. Just every couple of days do a few more stitches, or every day do a few more stitches, just to practice. And then come back in about a month and see where you're at. It's amazing how much just a little bit of practice will improve what you're doing. And I would really like to encourage you to try. Now I've got a tangle. With that tangle, it's because the thread is starting to twist. So when I had the tangle, instead of continuing to pull and pulling the tangle through, all I did was try to smooth out the threads by pulling gently back, and generally they will smooth out. Now, when you get to the end of the thread and you need to tie it off, normally it's done on the back side so you don't see. Excuse me, just burped. Instead of doing a knot, well, you can do a knot, but you go underneath the stitches, and then again, and again. You go one direction, and then you do it again the other direction, just once or twice. It makes it a little thicker, but it will hold it nicely. And then you simply snip off the thread. Oh, my scissors are over there. You snip off the thread close to the stitches, and there you are. Thank you very much for watching and listening. I apologize for the camera quality, but I'll be able to rig something up that'll work a little bit better soon, and hopefully we can get the auto focus and everything working a little bit better.